Okay, well, Dr. Gilbert, there you are. Our
So
morning crew for this morning, afternoon for you. And
just before I share my slides,
yeah.
I'll just set my timer for about 35 minutes.
Sure.
It's going. So just before I kind of share my slides, I normally have an introductory slide because I'd initially set part of this deck out for a shorter deck. I didn't include it. So I'm Stephen Gilbert. I'm Professor of Medical Device Regulatory Science in the TUG Dresden University of Technology. So it's a kind of being university in Dresden. I'm looking at the medical school. I'm in a cross-faculty institute, which is, it's called the Elsa Kruner-Fresenius Institute of Digital Health. So digital health is in the title, and this will be a very digital health talk. And I appreciate there's a spectrum of the audience, which is right across medical devices here. And some of you may be less interested in digital health. This could be slightly hard going, but it is digital health where it intersects not only software, but sensors and wearables. And those aspects include hardware manufacturing, hardware medical device design, and some thinking in that area. The reason I wanted to go around the audience is, although I don't consider myself particularly young anymore, I'm possibly on the younger side of the overall audience, not younger than everybody in the call. And I also, if you add up your total number of years in the medical device industry with somebody with 45 years, that's rather exceptional. I probably have 3% of the total number of years in the medical device industry. Speaking in the call, I have 10 years experience overall in the medical device industry, and I'm working as a professor in this field. I am conscious that it's quite an experienced audience. I cannot come across as a bit of an upstart. I can be critical of certain approaches. Sometimes, everything we're doing is wrong. I don't think everything we're doing is wrong, but I give you the kind of pre-warning. So you've read the instructions for use, and you've read a very clear warning at the start. And I sometimes try and be controversial. And you might completely disagree with everything I present, but that can always be fun. Let's find the share button. And then
I'd like to hear about the class you teach. How many students? And
that's a good question. And I'll just get the share up, just checking that we got. Yeah. Can you see okay the shared slides? And I'll answer this question. I actually don't teach a class. I hosted several summer schools. I do deliver a class for the EIT. European Institute for Innovation and Technology, which is an online course, and I probably will teach some courses which are in development. So bioengineering course, which is a regulatory module, regulatory and legal aspects, and potentially parts of a master's course which relate to robust systems development. At the moment, I don't teach. It's always planned that 95% of my position will be regulatory science research and maybe 5% teaching in the future. Now, I'm happy that's a bit bigger in teaching, but my main role is not teaching. So that maybe is a research professor position. There are other similar positions in the US. You're probably aware that the FDA has a number of affiliated universities as part of their kind of academic links to regulatory science. It's actually much more established in the US than it is in Europe. I'm quite an early professor in this space in the European setting. But Harvard and Stanford and a number of other universities, I'd need to check the list, but the ones that spring immediately to mind are Harvard and Stanford already have affiliated regulatory science research institutes to the FDA. And that's a little bit of my background. Before I worked I started my role, I've been 2 years as a professor in Dresden. I continue to interact with the medical device industry very closely. Before that, I worked for 3 years in a medical AI-based medical device software as a medical device manufacturer, as kind of director of clinical evaluation of clinical studies. And before that, I worked in a more traditional company that's in the area of manufacture of implantable defibrillators and pacemakers and cardiac monitors and so on in Germany. And I'm still an advisor to that company. It's called the latter company, the digital health company, it's called Ada Health. So if I my disclosure slide up, I would state that I'm an advisor to that company. And I'm also an advisor on a number of consultation projects with the European Commission, the Director General of Health in the European Commission. So I can say that partly as disclosures and partly as context. The areas I primarily work with are digital, software, AI, health policy, new developments in regulation, and the intersection between drugs and digital medical devices. They're my main research areas. But they're pretty broad. And I do a lot of work on large language models, which is not what I'm going to present in this particular presentation. And the title, subtitle is Looking Ahead and Suites. And I want to talk to you about suites of medical devices when we look at software and digital. Right. When we look at digital health technologies, so we can think of examples. So the company I used to work for was a entirely software as a medical device. digital health symptom checker application based on a mobile phone. But digital health technologies also bring in quite a wide range of other technologies. So monitors and consoles within the intensive care unit, and also hardware devices which have software on them. So things like Apple Watch, the hardware itself not being a medical device, but certain of the software algorithms being medical device on the software. And this talk partly mentions some things about reimbursement, which I'm not going to focus on in this particular presentation so much. It mostly focuses on the question of how we deal with future which may involve a greater degree of flexibility in the grouping together devices. And it asks the question, is there anything out of order? Are there actually any problems when we face our traditional model of design controls, software development through quality management systems, verification, validation, clinical evidence generation, approval, and relatively fixed products on the market? Does that match the developing, what could be another model of a developing future for suites? So flexible, the word suites we use in this sense to mean flexible interactions and groupings of medical devices. So that's a basic starting introduction. And what I'm going to present in this presentation is actually based on two viewpoint articles that are quite deep viewpoint articles which present this context, which were published in the Nature Portfolio Journal's Digital Medicine Journal in the preceding 2 months. There's a series of 2 articles. So the first one is entitled Digital Health Technologies Need Regulation and Reimbursement that Enable Flexible Interactions and Groupings. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about a figure. I'll go on to the second part of the figure in a second. But this figure sets out to explain what I mean by a flexible grouping, what I mean by a suite of devices. And this concept won't be completely new to many of those working in the medical device field, and particularly those working in the digital field. But we make an argument within the paper, and I'll show later that we're not alone in making this argument, that this is an increasingly important question. And the answer of how it should be regulated is not necessarily the answer, well, we should do exactly the same as we've always done everything else in the past, because everything within the regulatory space has already been discovered. There is no need for any change. There can be no change in any circumstances. That's very much not the approach I take. The entire approach of medical device regulatory science, or regulatory science in general, is to ask the question, how should things be regulated? And sometimes to ask the question, how should new things we've not had before be regulated, which delivers the best from what regulatory systems are supposed to deliver, rather than to say, well, we've heard of that before, it's just another version of X, Y, or Z. It might be another version of X, Y, Z, it might not be. So we'll start off with an example that I quite like, and it is one of my research themes, of looking at the hospital at home. Does anybody know the hospital at home concept?
We've talked about it a number of times.
Cool, Grant. So you're already familiar. So some of this, for some of those attending, may be repetition. So the hospital at home concept could be delivered in a variety of ways, and sometimes in different countries it means different things. When I'm using the term, I'm really thinking of the model of care which came to the fore in the COVID period, particularly with respiratory disease. But it's a model that allows you to release patients earlier to home. So in that sense, the hospital at home, it's not chronic disease remote digital monitoring that may reduce the number of follow-up visits when you go back to the clinic. That's not hospital at home. That would be remote monitoring, home monitoring. When I'm using the word hospital in the home in this setting, it's the patient is going home earlier than they would do previously, because an aspect of the hospital care and oversight can be delivered through digital human interactions, through telemedical infrastructure and humans to enable their care at home. So that's the definition that I'm using of hospital at home here. And already when I describe that, you can already clearly see that that involves a series of digital technologies and human technologies that need to work together to enable that model of care. So you can have within that, or will have within that, certainly things like continuous remote monitoring. Now that overlaps chronic disease monitoring, but it's not in the same circumstances as chronic disease monitoring. You could have things within that which are smart pillboxes, which can in certain circumstances be medical devices, depending on exactly what their international, which country context you're looking at and what their medical claims are. But individual medical devices, continuous remote monitoring things, individual medical devices, because they have a medical purpose. Alert systems, which depending again on their precise purpose, will have a medical purpose on their own. Patient support applications, I mean applications for patient support here, so interactive applications, they may or may not be medical devices, but again, it depends on their precise claims and the degree to which they're doing automation of patient support versus purely being a communications tool. Quite an interesting court case in Germany about some of these type of applications. And then it could include health sensors, even implants. Mostly we'll be talking about wearable sensors, but theoretically you could have a implanted sensor that's previously there, like a Medtronic heart, subcutaneous heart sensor could be linked to these systems, etc. Theoretically. When you link those together, along with the human support systems, you can have a system where you enable the patient to be monitored from home and to deliver interactive care, so with the telemedicine aspects of the portal, and including having home visits from community health workers as required. So that's a description of one aspect of a suite. So a flexible interaction of digital tools. Now, the word flexible, you could actually question here, because you could make that a rigid interaction. You could say, and incidentally, in the UK, particularly, but also in the US, as far as I'm aware, this was allowed to be flexible during COVID. So again, COVID, special conditions, there were a certain degree of loosening of previous regulatory enforcement for certain COVID type applications, and there were implementations which were relatively flexible during that time. One could actually foresee a model which is not flexible at all, where you absolutely had the type of smart pillbox, the type of alert system, the type of patient support applications, the type of sensors, the type of continuous monitoring technologies, the type of patient communication technologies, and even the workflows with the doctors as entirely tied down. No flexibility within your system. You could require that to be pre-set out as a kind of system, a system within the medical device regulation rules for systems. Your entire risk assessment took the entire thing together. The argument, part of the argument here is that's not actually a very feasible or sustainable model for these technologies moving forward, but I'll come back to this argument. So the wider part of the argument of the paper is that when we look at technologies, so we give the hospital at home is now on the bottom mid of the screen, the mid lower level here, you can see hospital at home. This is one of a whole series of different types of suites of devices. We give examples of use cases. This is not exhaustive, but a very obvious parallel one is the home monitoring setting. Now, the home monitoring setting shares many of the individual medical devices, which were also part of the hospital at home setting, but the setting is different. It's no longer the patient who's released early from hospital. It's the patient who's under chronic monitoring, home monitoring. We're familiar with this model. It was used, it's used quite a lot in pacemaker, in care of cardiac patients, and probably be all aware of Medtronic and Biotronic and Boston Scientific, etc. systems that can do remote monitoring. And there's a whole series of remote monitoring technologies, home monitoring that can use suites of technologies. This is looking particularly at suites and the interaction of different tools, but in a chronic disease approach to reduce follow-up. There's the individual setting. Now, the individual setting is not home-based. So that's where you're talking about wearables and sensors. It could be in the sense of remote monitoring, but it's no longer home-centric remote monitoring. A lot of the home-centric technologies have traditionally and still use home-based hubs. But you can have a situation where you have more flexible groupings of sensors which are interacting wearable use cases, which are again used for aspects of disease monitoring. So that's an individual setting. You go to the telemedicine setting, which is more linked to the communication with the patient without an ongoing monitoring role. It's actually about the setting of the conversation with the doctor. And again, you've got an overlapping of the types of technologies which go into that setting. And those can include sets of medical devices which the patient use. They're kind of analogs of the doctor use tool. So I'm sure you're aware of companies like Taito Care, which provide a kit, actually a not very flexible kit in that sense, where they're provided as a specific kit of medical devices that allow the patient to do ear examination, a digital otoscope, which works via telemedicine with the doctor looking at the images, but with the patient holding it in their ear, etc. Digital stethoscope, patient holds it on their chest, but the heart sounds can be listened to by the doctor. So you kind of have a loop of care, but using medical devices, using human in the loop. So that's yet another setting, again, with overlap of the individual components. Then we have a care home setting. Now, the care home setting overlaps the, we've got the care home setting at the bottom left. We've got the hospital clinic setting at the bottom right. On my screen, these may be the other way around on your screen. I just get confused by the mirroring thing. But these are very similar settings, but obviously in a different context. One is many elderly people together in a care home versus a hospital setting where you've got ill people undergoing treatment in wards. But you can see there's allies across the different medical devices used in these contexts. And I think I've actually covered all of the settings. So the argument from this figure is that you have components which are brought together within different sets to form a specific grouping. And the individual parts of those components could either be rigid, so within each grouping, you'd have an approval which does not allow any flexibility of substitution in or substitution out, or you've got flexibility of substitution in and substitution out. So if we consider the kind of European current regulatory setting for this type of scenario. So I mentioned before that there kind of is an article of the MDR which describes kind of systems and procedures packs, and it's not that anything is impossible under current regulation. Current regulation does not say any of these use cases are banned. To be quite clear, the MDR doesn't really ban any use cases, unlike some non-medical use cases banned in the AI Act in Europe. There's nothing specifically banned, but these are rather challenging use cases to create in a practical manner under current regulatory approval systems, because you're talking about multi-manufacturer systems or a situation where you have to get one manufacturer to bring these entire systems together. Now, there is a MDCG guidance from not that long ago, MDCG 2023-4, and this sets out basically it's a regulatory procedure to shift the responsibility into the people who bring that together as a package. And you could say that's fair enough. It puts a lot of responsibility on when bringing suites together, saying, well, that can be done by the company that's going to bring that onto the market as a system of medical devices, but they effectively have to cooperate into that. Approaches for testing each part of an individual substitutable flexible medical device within the risk approaches, within the post-market surveillance monitoring approaches, and so on. There's been a lot of debate within Europe about the actual implications of what it really includes and what it doesn't, whether it would exclude actually having things like an Apple Watch used as part of a flexible system when it's not itself a medical device and when you don't have full control over it. There's a lot of debate and a lot of different opinions on the interpretation of this. I'm not saying it's all wrong. I'm saying that it may not be the final state of where we want to get to in the regulation of what we allow within suites of medical devices. So that kind of brings the argument a bit further. So I'm going a lot slower than the last time I presented this, which is fine, because the last time I had to really rush it. You kind of have you kind of see it as a two roads you could take. One is they kind of move fast and break things. Regulation of this space should, we need much less regulation. I doubt there's many within this particular audience that are on that side, but maybe some of the people who are also CEOs of small companies might be on that side, and the US market overall. If we look at software, there are many softwares which are not regulated in the US, which are regulated in Europe, and there are many softwares which are under enforcement discretion in the US, which are very strictly regulated in Europe. So many of you actually may be more on the less regulation. And then there's kind of another approach, which is kind of slightly to bury your head in the sand. Say, well, the systems and what the ideas we've had from the past, there's actually no need for change. There is no problem here. That would be in my view, the bury the head in the sand approach. All I'm really saying is within the main first paper is actually a recognition that there is at least a challenge from these new technologies and from approaches one would take within these new technologies that maybe ask the question, could there be better, different approaches in how we look at how these devices are grouped together? Now, when we were writing this paper, quite conveniently, do people know who this man is? So no direct responses, but I would assume the US audience will largely know who Dr. Robert Califf is. So he, in terms of anybody that doesn't, I'll just give a brief introduction. So he served as FDA commissioner under Obama. Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more US side than me, but under the Obama administration. He then, after he left as FDA commissioner, he went and worked for Alphabet, Google company, for 5 years as a senior consultant. He then was brought back by the Biden administration for a second term and is the current commissioner of the FDA. Depending on how your election goes, he may not be for that much longer. There's already speculation that within a Republican administration, he would not continue, or he would not be kept to continue. But in any case, I think he's quite an interesting character. And I think he speaks from a position of quite a lot of thought about this within his organization, the FDA, but also within his own thinking of having quite a lot of experience of working from this. Could say he's biased, having worked for Google before. But this was a statement that he made at a recent tech conference on this theme. And it came out at the same time as we were writing the paper. So I was actually quite grateful for this statement, because part of some of my work, sometimes I'm a little bit scared if I'm talking about Star Trek medicine or going completely out on a limb and talking about stuff that nobody else would care or think about. But what he says at the conference is, if you think about device development like sensors, if you do it one at a time, you're never going to put a whole suite together into something that fits together in the home environment. I put the word home in there, but actually, it's actually the environment in general. The Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, is working on a strategy on how to create regulatory pathways to help make that happen. So that's a kind of recognition of the problem. Now, it doesn't mean that you all have to agree there's a problem, but FDA, not all these ideas actually come from the top, so either from the bottom up or from the top down, recognize there's a problem, and then are saying that they're working on strategies. So that's kind of the next situation within policy. My dad's a minister, but I always forget where things come from in the Bible. But there's a quote, there's nothing new under the sun. And some of you have been working in the medical device industry for 45, 50 years, and there's a lot of experience here. And you can kind of say, well, systems and interaction, and even flexible aspects of interaction, there's nothing new. There's nothing new here. This has all been seen before. And to a very large extent, there isn't something fundamentally new about the interaction of medical devices. Within the paper, we talk about the intensive care unit. So the intensive care unit within a hospital is a whole series of interacting medical devices. Most of them don't, some of them directly interact, and some of them interact through the clinician. So arguably, not new. Hospitals have had it for years. Another example that you could give where this is not new is actually, if we look slightly outside the digital space, the orthopedic kits that doctors build up, often they're built with many subcomponents, and they're all packaged together and sterilized together, and they go to a surgeon to create a kit together. And those aren't regulated if they're made up by the hospital as a kit of that doctor's, so that surgeon's preferred operating things, operating instruments and implants and screws, etc. That's also not regulated as a medical device because it's been brought together by the hospital for a particular doctor, their favorite recipe of tools. Again, it's not seen as necessary either to reimburse that as a package, and these papers are partly about reimbursement, or to regulate that as a package. Another area, so I actually took this from the website of the Yoner Institute, because the last time that I was speaking on these themes was actually on a seminar, on a webinar that was hosted by the Yoner Institute. That was just an example. It's quite a famous example in European court judgment that was on a question of electronic health record systems and having modules within electronic health record systems, including modules that do decision support within electronic health record systems. And this is quite a detailed consideration of systems in the context of subcomponents and modules of software. The decision of the European Court at that time was having one module, which is a medical device decision support system within a wider software, does not make the entire software a medical device. This was actually at the time of our previous regulations in medical devices, not the current regulations, but it still has relevance and impacted the current regulations.
Stephen, I looked it up. It's Ecclesiastes 1, verse 9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And I had no idea that was a biblical.
Okay, so I actually had the full quote in the first version of the paper, and I thought it was too much, and I took it out. And I think I actually, initially I had it, I kind of cut it down and then I cut it out completely, just didn't seem to fit. But I like it. My father would have been deeply embarrassed that I couldn't have said that it was from Ecclesiastes when I...
You don't have to tell him.
I don't want, you won't tell him either.
I won't, and I don't know that he's going to watch the recording.
He probably won't be.
He's going to sit 30 minutes into it for revelation. Let me ask the group, do you have any questions? Because Stephen's been on quite a tear. Perhaps there's an area, a jumping off point of conversation that you'd like. If not, we can continue with this.
I'm absolutely happy to take one, and then I'll do a few more slides. I won't go into the second theme. We'll stick to the sweets theme.
Yes. I have one question, or let's say food for thinking. Yes, in these complex digital systems, the difficulty that we have one startup is the priority of which module should certify first, and progressively bring all the other setups in the full system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
practically, we to help you. What we hear very often in our days is one device, one cloud, where the doctor decides something, then to the cloud, and cloud brings back. So if I sit down and I say, okay, I'm startup, I have so much budget, I want to certify now one device. The device with its system, that will be, Mr. Gilbert, very interesting to analyze that. Thank you very much for the nice presentation.
So I acknowledge the point. I think some of the slides slightly address that point later, but maybe not fully, but you can come back to me with that. Are there any other points we want to bring up at the moment? I may not answer them. I may say that I'm covering them in later slides, but if you want to bring up any points, it also helps me when I'm showing a slide where I think the slide partly deals with that to bring that into my discussion. So if you want to bring up any other points, there's one hand up from...
Yeah, if you don't mind, I got a question to ground where you're at. where in your development cycle is this? Because I've been talking to, there's a company here, I'm just putting in the chat. I've been talking to a company in the US called Asvida.com that does a lot of devices for home healthcare and recovery and things like that. Are you just suggesting that your solution, the way you're putting all these solutions together and then sending them to regulatory, is it ready for market? Are you just designing this? Give me a sense of how to ground this.
So, that's a very good question. I'll maybe tackle that one just now. So this presentation is primarily about a summary of US current policy directions. So changes soon to come. So what one might anticipate from next FDA guidance and what one might anticipate a little bit slower coming into certain aspects of European guidance. And so it's not a presentation, I think, where 95% of it, you could say, I'm immediately going to take that point and build it into my product. It's more about the pipeline, and I'll get to the pipeline. So there's a slide which I'll show about the next steps in the FDA progress in this model, which will part to fill it in. But I hope that's not a presentation which of no interest to you. For me, what's coming in the pipeline or might be coming in the pipeline is always the most interesting thing, but I appreciate for those that are working sometimes as consultants in the coalface, you're only interested in what you can immediately activate. I see there's a lot more questions, so I'll come back.
If I can add one quick, are you doing any reference to Japan? Because I'm talking to a hospital system that's actually testing this out with 300 families in Okinawa.
Yeah, so good question. In some other regulatory work, so particularly on adaptive systems, I do refer to Japanese approaches. So in terms of algorithm change protocols and predetermined change control plans, where some of the approaches in Japan were way advanced, or a couple of years in advance of FDA approaches. So in other work, yes, I have to be quite honest, for this particular challenge, I've not looked at Japan, but I think Japan, and even more so, South Korea and Singapore are very relevant to look at in this place. I would say more Singapore than Japan in this particular example. There's 3 more questions, but we probably just take the topics and we list the topics, and then I'll see if I cover them in the remaining slides. So we go for Rick first.
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing about some of your more divergent views to which you referred earlier, if only to help me understand the existing system better.
Yeah, cool. So I think I'll touch on some of those, particularly in terms of a paper and a number of papers in progress that will come up in the later slides. So then if we take the point from Maren, and I'll note it down and see if I can address it in the slides, and then from Ronald.
I just wanted to say that I think there's an interesting balance between giving hospitals and physicians freedom to put together approved products in packages versus how do you design something that works as a package.
Yeah. Yeah, I accept that point, and that's part of the way we bring it up in the paper is not to say those are exactly the same thing. We actually say, is there anything new under the sun? And make this more as an argument, this is something new under the sun. It's not to say it was exactly the same as before, and not to say those things were the same. It's more to say this is actually a new thing, but there's still 2 ways of which one can regulate the new thing. One can go and say, it's regulated as not a flexible suite. Nothing is actually flexible in its regulation, or no new regulatory approaches are needed. Or you can bifurcate and go in the other direction. New regulatory approaches are both called for, needed, and need to be designed and tested. Actually, in better regulation principles. You don't just design regulation; you make sure your regulation works, and that's something we tend to leave out of the regulatory system. What regulations have ever been tested? FDA pre-cert pilot program had a lot of testing of a concept, but most other regulations not actually tested at all. It failed, like MDR, miserably in its delivery. There's lots of newspaper articles. There's a scandal. There's a new act of parliament, which is again based on regulations not tested. Ronald's got a point, but I think I've addressed that point as much as probably will be able to in this call, Maren. But I need to I'll get some of the slides which address the other points. Ronald, you got a point? I'm anticipating a difficult point from Ronald.
This week I've worked for a client of me that's an American software company. They're not the smallest one. You may know the name, but I'm not going to mention it here. They want to place certain software, medical device software, on the market in Europe. It works together with all sorts of wearables, with cloud-based solutions and what have you. And they want to have a very smart and flexible system there. And they wanted to know if they could have certain components in that system left out of the MDR requirements. And so they're talking about things like security, like authentication of the patient, right? Do we have the right patient here and with access to the system? those things. They're not medical applications. So what I did for them is to attach that, to link that to Article 22. So system, all these things must have their intended purpose specified, that they can be used together. And I sort of made a demarcation: when is something medical device software, when it's an accessory, and when it's something else. And it's very interesting to see that you have the term software controlling other devices. We had a big discussion about that. But that concept is only linked to classification. So software intended for other for controlling other devices must first be a medical device before it can be classified. And that makes it very easy. Would you agree that if you have something that sort of controls you first, it must have this medical function, and not about just stopping or starting an app to work?
So I like the description part, and I think the approaches that you're taking are obviously you have a lot of experience in the space, and I'm not surprised that you're working within similar challenges within Article 22. I've also had to work with some. It is possible to find a way forward within Article 22. Article 22 is relatively short. Some people saw it as actually bringing in more restrictions again, and the MDCG guidance that go with it, subsequent to the position that existed previously with the European Court judgment and the position of MDD. I'm not saying that a very good regulatory consultant cannot find a way forward that enables flexibility to some extent. And I'm also not saying, like I've worked previously in this, not so much with sensors, but within applications running on different mobile phone technology platforms. And, and one of the points that's clearly identified with MDR that needs to particularly be addressed is the display point. Not because that's a particularly important point, it's just the thing that the regulators thought to write in at that stage of development of the MDR. It's not to say that manufacturers cannot come up with clever ways of dealing with the question of how to test in real time that their devices are running adequately from risk assessment. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think I very much go alongside your line of thinking. The question really is being asked here is, are there further movement that's needed that doesn't just rely on very ingenious companies alone with very good regulatory consultants in a gray area around Article 22 and also the FDA regulations, as opposed to revision of those? I always take the perspective on regulation. I know it has to be fixed for some period of time. Particularly changing regulation in Europe is extremely challenging. Changing regulation in the current framework post-Chevron and in the political situation in the USA is also extremely challenging. But I always take the perspective that regulation was not carried down from Mount Sinai by Moses to be followed in tablets of stone. And that's not to say that we should tear up everything and throw it out, but we should be looking at whether it's fit for purpose. And particularly in the current political climate, Brexit, I know it's something you comment quite a lot on LinkedIn. I'm not a fan of Brexit either, but one of the groundings of Brexit and also of certain political movements in other parts of the world is actually we have too much regulation. I've published other papers on this. We do need to find a balance in regulation for what society wants in regulation. And my personal position is Article 22 on its own with the MDCG guidance is not adequately flexible, but I'll come back to some additional slides on this.
Actually, let me administrative note, just because we were having so much conversation, I temporarily stopped the sharing of your screen so we could see one another better. That's one.
Okay, cool. Oh, good. I think there's one more question. I think
there is, Stephen, if I may, just again, administratively, Sean Smith, I sent you a private message here in the chat for you to review regarding the form you wanted us to review. And then third, Karen Deep, you have your hand raised. Thank you, Stephen.
Would it be okay to take Karen Deep's question at the end?
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, thank you very much so far. Sure, if you want to. Perfect, that's fine.
Yeah, so I maybe just do a couple of slides and then we'll come back to your question, and I may be able to address some of the other points in this. So I appreciate we only have 10 minutes left.
We don't need to stop at the top of the hour if we go over a little, but some people will drop off.
Yeah, so like part of the argument of the second paper, which is in this series of two papers, and they're open access if you want to read them, and if I'm still interested in these themes after speaking, it's just recognition of the problem and looking at certain approaches towards conditional approval and flexible approaches to monitoring. And I'll come back to this flexible approaches to monitoring. We discuss regulatory sandboxes in this use case, in this setting. Regulatory sandboxes are the kind of current in-trend solution to every regulatory problem. I don't want to overstate the need here, and I'll skip over shared financial risks. So that's very much on the reimbursement side, and we're talking about the regulatory side here, but the papers cover both. And I'll skip over this. I'll actually skip over this one as well. And I'll just, in terms of Does anybody? Sorry, I've lost the faces. I don't know if I'll get them back again just now. Just give me 1 second. I'll go without having seen your faces. I prefer to see your faces when presenting. Does anybody know that, or has anybody seen the launch of the FDA's Healthcare at Home initiative, which was on the 23rd of April? If not, like basically what the FDA did is their next step. So of course, if the FDA Commissioner Robert Califf is standing at a conference and saying we do have some plans in place to look at this, you can expect an imminent either blog, action plan, or guidance. And in this case, it's a kind of action plan. It's an initiative. And what they've launched is an initiative. There's a third paper in this series, which should come out in about 2 weeks' time in the same journal. It's kind of part 3. And what part 3 looks at is actually the FDA's current plans to look at this question. And they look at quite interesting, and it's one of the focuses of the paper. You've probably seen this written up in other parts of the regulatory press. And this is kind of a write-up within the scientific journal perspective, and it is a slightly more scientific approach. The FDA launches this hub kind of recognizing pretty much the same presentation of the problem as stated in the previous slides, but they take a particular focus on the importance of care at home in the developing healthcare system, and they take a particular focus on the aspects of health equity. And I think this is very interesting because normally one doesn't think of the FDA as a regulator, which is looking with health equity as its core principle. One generally thinks for them, certainly when the roles that we have is working within the medical device industry and regulatory affairs as consultants or as companies trying to get devices approved, as being kind of more gatekeepers. But they mention the word equity. I need to check actually in the paper. It's either 7 or 9 times, and it's a core theme right throughout these 3-4 pages where they announce the launch of their Healthcare at Home initiative. The Healthcare at Home initiative looks precisely at this question of suites. It makes the argument that the entire way the regulatory system is set up would never promote the functioning flexible design of suites. It actually, the way that the regulatory system is currently set up, leads to a rather kind of artificial non-flexibility. It disincentivizes any work from individual companies to work together to have greater flexibility. And it also disincentivizes the uses of the latest technology within the consumer space or the developing of those consumer technologies to be safer in terms of cybersecurity and interaction, to actually be safe to be used as medical devices. It also makes the point that those consumer technologies developing purely as consumer technologies will never go in the direction of being appropriate for medical device use. So it kind of looks at this problem from 2 sides. And it sets out an argument that the use of these technologies is fundamentally important to delivering equitable healthcare, not only in the future visions of how healthcare systems could be reshaped, but actually making the argument that these digital health technologies are critical to solving and resolving some of the problems of current health inequity in the US. So I can share via the organizers this paper link when it comes out. It's not published just yet. Okay. And then I've kind of like 5 minutes until the full time, and I'll stop at the full time. And those who want to stay on to ask any additional questions, I can probably stay for 20 minutes. But my wife's already phoned, and it's 6 o'clock here, so I better not stay beyond 20 minutes. And in a number of other papers that I'm working on, this is slightly more looking in the solutions direction rather than the problem space. And I ask in these other papers, and I cite these papers from the series of papers on suites, a fundamental question which relates to digital health technologies. And you may disagree with me on this, but I'll set out the argument. The argument is that digital health technologies and artificial intelligence as integrated within digital health technologies are not static things. And what do I mean by they're not static? They're developed over time as software. And even wearables are developed over time more than traditional devices. But the interaction between wearables and medical devices are typically generated, and I've worked in medical device companies, using agile approaches to the extent that they're allowed under regulatory, the limited degree of agile allowed under regulatory processes to be adaptive. They should be adaptive. Their interfaces are adaptive. The precise way they present information, the usability, the screens, the user experience are adaptive. They have a dynamic nature. And AIs, so AIs as a subset of digital health technologies, but increasingly used, are also technologies which are inherently open to approaches to relearning based on data, if regulatory systems allow. And even under current regulatory systems, which have only started to open up to the idea of closer to real-time learning, those systems are more frequently updated, even if that requires an approval process with manufacturers. So they are dynamic. The second point here is that they are highly interactive. Now, we had previous examples of kind of old-fashioned suites of medical devices that may be orthopedic implants, or even the intensive care unit of 20 years ago. Now, there were digital systems, and to a degree in which they interacted, but they interact in a much less degree than the way that the healthcare system is going, where data is a means of flowing of information between different modules, different types of those systems, as we demonstrated for the suites, or even through different digital AI-based decision support systems, which require the physician in the loop to integrate that information. So there's a need in which there's a sense in which the usability and the function of these systems are interacting with the systems. Now, you may disagree with that starting premise, but that's the starting premises I have, 1 and 2. And I go from those 2 starting premises to ask the question, so we're in this world we're entering, which is increasingly of a dynamic, adaptable, automated, and interconnected and scalable digital health technologies and AIs. Why are we not developing our oversight, our performance, and our monitoring systems to be scalable, dynamic, adaptable, automated, and interconnected? And we are not doing so. That is not a process. At the moment, post-market surveillance exists as an island run by the manufacturer, and manufacturers do it on their own. Even when they have to, by regulations, consider the system, they consider the system in an island on their own. There may be tiny examples of where manufacturers and healthcare providers have really teamed up to do it open on their own, but it's absolutely not the standard. And I can't say in my own life I've really come across any functional aspect of that. And just as a last slide, of the final acknowledgement slide. So this is one of a series of 3 papers. One is, this is the accepted one, which is in Journal of Medical Internet Research from last year. We have another one that's in the late peer review process for scientific reports on the Nature journals, and we have another one we're about to submit, and a series of arguments. We set out this argument that holistic human-serving digitalization of healthcare needs integrated and automated system-level assessment tools. And again, I'm not going to have a chance to speak about the full context of this paper after I switch off the screen because I can't see you anymore. I'll just give a little bit of a more introduction of this concept. Before I do that, I'll just acknowledge that the work in this study is part of a Horizon European funding initiative looking at the regulation health technology of digital health technologies, and it involves numerous partners. The partners that were actually involved in the work I describe are the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, who are involved in the health technology assessment of all healthcare technologies, including medicines and medical devices in the UK, and also the University of Oxford and my own university, the Technical University of Dresden. So I shall stop sharing, and then I can see you again. And I maybe just go back to that slide before last to give a little bit more context in that. So what we're really talking there about is linking together post-market surveillance and a frightening concept, which maybe is not so frightening when you think about it deeper. At the moment, as medical device companies and as consultants working for medical device companies, we go to extreme lengths that data on performance of our tools is secret. Now, to a limited extent, with the MOD database and with the coming UDAMED database in Europe and things like summary statements of clinical performance, there will be a small degree of opening up of the silos in health data. What we're actually doing in these papers is making a controversial argument that the building out of a system of digital healthcare that actually would enhance equity and also is called for to help tackle the problem of healthcare delivery. Exactly what the doctor calls for is radically open data on performance across systems, across devices. In other words, put it out in the public. And completely forget the idea that we need to keep our data locked, closed. We've seen examples recently of one of the major problems with Philips, much bigger than the problem with their medical devices, was their problem of keeping the data in silos within the company and with regulators. A much better approach for particularly very novel things we're talking about, like suites and AI systems, is that the data is in the public domain. You enable feedback from the users in a public sense, and that will enable the development of this sector of AI and digital health applications and the interaction in a much faster way. That's the end of the time. I don't know if I've answered your questions. I'm happy to take further questions. I can kind of stay for 15, 20 minutes, but then I better go.
Well, to the group then, a number of hands went up. I lost track of whether he addressed everything. Is there anything you wanted to follow up with, team? Indeed, yes, we can get to yours. Thank you, Ronald.
Yeah, so excellent talk. The Question I often get from people, especially young people who want to get into digital health. Are there resources that you would recommend for people who want to learn about digital health and most importantly, keep up to date with the various changes happening about the world?
So keeping up to date. So I'm going to be really cheeky and recommend some of my own papers. So I've a couple that I've written with Hugh Harvey of Hardy, who you work with. Looking at the role of app stores here, including in feedback, their responsibility, and looking at, I mentioned app stores and the responsibility within this, but I think it's an absolutely critical question on the aspects of post-market surveillance. They bring actually quite a lot of good to post-market surveillance. As previously working in a digital health company, part of our post-market surveillance was delivered through the Google App Store feedback and through the Apple App Store feedback. We had to look at that. We had to, within our trend reporting and our complaints, to be looking at that data. So that aspect of app stores is good. Many other aspects of app stores is bad. So sorry, that's slightly getting off the theme. It's on a paper that I worked on with one of your colleagues. So I would suggest my own papers, of course, but there are many other papers in this space. And of course, not just the scientific literature. Sometimes the scientific literature is a challenge, but it's good to read because you get such a dichotomy of there's this kind of false dichotomy, which often happens. You get people talking, let's say, large language models, another area that I've worked with Hugh on papers on large language models. You get one side of this argument that is almost like, talking about healthcare development, anything goes. There's such a new, brave world of possibilities. And then you kind of get this other side saying none of this is possible. Regulation says no. And there's very little meeting in the middle. Now, if one reads the literature, but tries to find, and I think having a resource, and it might be a good idea that we create some as a recommendation for people who want to actually think about that coming together of those things. Where does the regulation need to go? Which is not no regulation and is not no devices, no changes, nothing can be new. But I would recommend some of my own papers. Summaries in this, again, there isn't a single resource. There are many webinars. There's some that are done by you. I've seen some of those. There's some that are done by other groups. It would be quite useful if somebody brought many of the better resources together in a kind of repository of internet journal sources. Whoever brought that together is going to be the editor, and they will bring their own biases to that. I'm not sure I'm answering your question perfectly. Do you have any suggestions yourself of how to better address that? Like just before you say it, of course, MDCG guidance, blogs by the MHRA, blogs by the FDA, blogs by the European Commission, although I consult for them at the moment, not quite as good, but those spaces would also be part of that mix.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of the approach that I take with regulatory as well, keeping up with all the IMDRF papers, MDCG, FDA, etc. That's kind of the approach I took towards digital health as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned IMDRF, and absolutely. IMDRF are interesting in their context because they're often misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted by people as saying that's the law. IMDRF says X, therefore you can't do X. I think IMDRF in the context of what they are as an organization is absolutely relevant to cite, and some really interesting future thinking work that they've done in the space of single use or developed for single individual medical devices. So, for example, the 3D printing of based on digital models of devices for surgery, etc. So really quite fundamental new thinking and new approaches. But always reading the IMDRF in the context that it is not the regulation of any country. It's the international ideas in terms of how regulation should be best done.
Stephen, thank you. We're very generous with your time and your thoughts today. Before we conclude, Maren, you have enlisted our speaker for next week. Can you tell us about what Eric will discuss?
So I met Eric through the Alliance of Angels. This is Eric Broyles, and they've developed a new mechanism of delivering cancer drugs in a way that minimizes the toxicity from those, and is also intended to increase the number of people that actually respond to those drugs.
Very nice. That'll be an interesting talk, Stephen. Of course, you're welcome to join us. And I'll conclude with Richard. You wrote me this week, and you have a...
Joe, sorry, before you go on, are you in contact with Eric, and do you have all the information you need, or do you need to do something else for next week?
I believe we're set, but if you want to just double check with Anne,
okay.
The last step. Richard, you have something new on the horizon. Will you tell us what's going on with you?
Yeah, just quickly. I've been working on my own medical device software project for the last 6 years. but I'm not getting any younger, and it's sort of reaching a point where I can't fund it anymore. So I want to do other things. So I've made a decision to sort of get out of the industry. I'm going to sell my
folks who might not have been on your call a few weeks back, the nature of your software.
Yeah, so it's actually very relevant to Stephen's discussion, because what Stephen's talking about is really kind of some of the problems we're solving. So we have an app that's called Pura. You can download it now. It's unregulated, but basically we've solved a lot of problems about converting input data, relating it to healthcare conditions, and using that in medical algorithms to provide output. At the moment, we just have a touch interface that's sort of our regulatory firewall, shall we say. But we're working on laboratory integrations, wearable integrations, this sort of stuff. And yeah, so sort of, I could go on, but it's this targeting at this stage, very simple use case, saving results from in vitro diagnostic devices. And we're now transitioning to solving, collecting data sets, it's not algorithms at this point, around health conditions. And then we'll provide the algorithms for that. Yeah.
Who is the best fit? Who should reach you? Someone who what?
Yeah, so there's been a little change in the last 24 hours. So as I've decided to sell, I've been approached by one potential investor who wants to back me. So we're talking and we'll see how that goes. Very good guy and very experienced, so that may play out. So basically at this point, if somebody's interested in buying a Swiss-based medical device company with deployed software system with modern frameworks with ISO 13485 certification, please contact me. So you can take over the project, deploy it, commercialize it yourself, or just use the existing certification for your own project. It's up to you. Or if this deal goes through, there might be room for one more investor in this Series A. So I'm kind of open to offers at the moment. I'm leaving it to the universe. I believe in the project, I really do, but I just can't do it by myself. So, some backing by people. And it's nice to see a few people have actually come out in my support. So maybe I'm doing something right. Just feel free to contact me if there's any interest.
If you're not in direct contact with Richard, or for that matter with Stephen, and you'd like to follow up on this or other things with the network, you know where to find me. I appreciate you all today, and I will see you this time next week. Dr. Gilbert, thanks especially to you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks very much. Have a great
Thank you.
weekend.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.